Okay, so hi everyone. So this short lecture is gonna discuss operant conditioning. So in our previous class and the previous lecture, we discussed the three waves of behaviorism. We were introduced to those three waves, and they are classical conditioning, and we heard about Pavlov and Watson, operant conditioning, Skinner and Thorndike, and then social learning theory, we were introduced to Albert Bandura. So for this lecture, we're going to focus more on operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning dominated the sphere of psychology for a very long time and came to prominence from the early 1900s, 1910s, 1915s, and up to the 1960s. And as we discussed last time, it was all about focusing on measuring observable behavior and not internal emotional states. And they viewed things like fear and hunger to be physiological states that can be measured. And so we're going to look at the work first of E.L. Thorndike, who studied cats and other animals and looked at how behavior can be modified or changed based on the consequences that follow our action. So what are the consequences that come after us doing an action? And so for Thorndike, that was one of his major premises. And then we'll look at B.F. Skinner and how he builds on Thorndike's work, or kind of criticizes it to some extent, but still builds on it. So E.L. Thorndike's work is really interesting. And he actually was one of the first early operant conditioning theorists. And his work was based on putting cats in these puzzle boxes. And he was examining how long it would take these cats to escape from one puzzle box to another in a maze-like structure till they get to the end. And so when he first put them in the boxes, the cats would do what cats do, which is scratch at the bars. They would pull at the ceiling. They would dig at the floor. They would press. They would do a lot of things, but actually pressing one lever to allow them to move out of one box and into another, and then to the end, was one of the last actions they did when he first put them in the box. But as the cat realized that once they moved their way through the puzzle mazes, or the puzzle box mazes, that there was something waiting for them at the end of the puzzle box maze, which was food, right? Now, I don't know about you, but food is a huge motivator for me, or for most people, especially when you're hungry, like I kind of am right now, to actually do an action. So with the cat, using the food as a what he would call a satisfying consequence that follows a particular action, in this case pressing the lever and moving from one box to another, right? At the end of all of these boxes and at the end of pressing several levers, the cat would be rewarded with food. So after putting the cat in the box like several times, right, the cat realized, or came to be conditioned, let's use our words, right, conditioned to respond in a particular way. So instead of the cat scratching the bar or pulling at the ceiling or digging at the floor, all of these behaviors that didn't lead to the food at the end of the puzzle box, the cat actually anticipated the food at the end of the puzzle box, changed their behavior, and actually pressed the lever much more rapidly, much quickly, that would allow them to move from box to box to box to get to the food much more rapidly, and with some kind of measure of seeming control. But that only happened after the cat had been placed in this situation several times, and the cat came to learn that if I press this lever, it's going to allow me to come out of this box, move into another box, and eventually I'm going to get to the end. And what's at the end is something I enjoy, which is food. So if you think about it, the cat has been conditioned to respond to increase its action of pressing the lever to get to the end and to get to the food. So what has motivated the cat? The anticipation of food. That food, which is what Thorndike calls a satisfying consequence, right? And so the satisfying consequence motivates the cat to move from box to box to box by pressing the lever. So his action of pressing the lever gets increased because he wants to get this food. So when we think about, and this is Thorndike's theory from 1898, right? And so when we think about Thorndike, here's his premise, right? His main belief. He believed that responses that lead to satisfying consequences are more likely to be repeated. And in some ways, it's hard to disagree with this idea that your behavior or your response that you do that leads to something that is satisfying or pleasant is another good word here. Wanted is a good word. Desirable is also a good word. Something that you want, something that you desire, something that increases the satisfaction physiologically in your body will be done again. You're going to do that action again. For example, we talked about the example of finding $20 in the hallway, right? Now, $20 could be a huge motivator for people. What is it motivating you to do? You walk down the hallway, you find $20. Is your action of walking down the hallway a second time going to increase? According to this, yes, because $20 is a satisfying consequence or result or outcome of walking down that hallway. So what's the outcome of my walking down that hallway? It's finding $20. Is $20 a satisfying consequence to me? Yes. So am I at another date or another time more likely to walk down that hallway in anticipation of finding $20? Yes. I am more likely to walk down that hallway a second or a third time with the anticipation of finding $20 that I didn't have before, because that it's in addition to everything else that I have. So that's a satisfying consequence. So Thorndike inspired B.F. Skinner's work. So B.F. Skinner was born in 1904 and lived until 1990. And, he talked a lot about these kinds of satisfying consequences, but he also criticized Thorndike's work because he said that it's not just satisfying consequences that cause us to do behavior. It's possibly the opposite of that. What about punishing consequences or dissatisfactory kinds of consequences? Could they not motivate behavior too? And so he took up this work based on Neil Thorndike's work and others, and he created his own notion of operant conditioning. And so he didn't like, here it says it didn't like his satisfying state of affairs concept. And he was really interested in what are the consequences that really stimulate or cause behavior and cause our behavior to change. And he discusses who the operant is, or what operant really means to him. It's some kind of voluntary response that acts on the environment to produce consequences. But if we think about the operant embodied, the operant is us. It's the animal, it's the dog, it's the cat, it's all of us who are taking some action and paying attention to the consequences of the action, the outcome or the results of that action, and whether the results of that action are satisfying or not, or what Skinner doesn't call them satisfying. He actually calls them reinforcing or punishing. So are the consequences of my action reinforcing or punishing? And that will tell me whether I should do the behavior more or should I do the behavior less. So we're going to think about this idea of reinforcing and punishing, right? When you hear reinforcing, you think about behavior strengthening. You think about it increasing. When you hear it, because you call in for reinforcements, that's to strengthen your army or your soldiers, right? When you hear about punishing, don't think of the word bad. Think of the word as lessening or weakening a behavior, diminishing a behavior, or causing a behavior to stop, right? So we're gonna look at that notion. Skinner believed that the consequences of an action determine the likelihood of that action to be repeated, right? So this kind of extends our first equation from classical. In classical conditioning, we just had stimulus response, right, or stimulus action. And in some ways, this Skinner's criticism of classical condition is that there was too much emphasis placed on biological or physiological reaction. That humans and animals actually have this ability to kind of think about or anticipate what's going to happen next. That's how animals survive, right? And so, based on these things happening more than once, we can then change our behavior to suit at future times. Because remember, if we go back to the definition of behaviorism or learning, the definition is it's a relatively permanent change in behavior as a result of experience, or a change in behavior because of experience at one time affecting our behavior at a future time. So for him, he's saying, how do we change that behavior at a future time? What causes the behavior to change at a future time? And that would be, for him, the consequences, not just simply a stimulus and response. So he says that we pay attention to the consequences, that animals pay attention to the consequences and can anticipate that consequence happening, that consequence being satisfying, or that consequence being punishing, and then determine whether that determines whether the behavior happens more or whether the behavior happens less. So how do we define reinforcement? Reinforcement is defined as any consequence that follows an action that causes that same action to increase or to be repeated. And so think about it this way. So any kind of consequence. Continue, because we were interrupted. Reinforcement is any consequence that follows an action that causes that action to increase or to be repeated. So it makes it more likely to happen. So if any action is more likely to happen or happen again or be repeated, then we could say that that behavior has been reinforced or strengthened, right? So if you think about it, he talks about different kinds of reinforcers, right? So he says there are primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. A primary reinforcer is something that's biologically needed. So like water, air, food, right? Things that satisfy our biological needs. A secondary reinforcer is something that allows you to get a primary reinforcer. So money would probably be secondary. So what would having that $20 allow you to do? Buy some food, right? And take away your hunger. Are you going to keep trying to get $20? Probably, because that's how you would probably get to take away your hunger. In some ways, if we think about it, why do people go to work, right? Do people 100%, right? I'm just throwing this out there, go to work for the satisfaction of just feeling good on the inside? Or is it that people get paid, right? So getting paid allows you to have a place to stay, right? Buy food, be clothed, right? Feel warm, right? And take care of your family. So your job, which could be like maybe a tertiary thing, but it allows you to have the secondary thing, which allows you to have the primary thing. And so we're motivated at multiple levels, or we are reinforced at multiple levels, according to this theory, that makes us do a behavior more than less. So let's talk about this a little more. Let's talk about the two types of reinforcement. So with reinforcement and punishment, we have two types of reinforcers. So there's positive reinforcement and then there's negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, you see that add sign, that means something. That means we're adding something to the situation that's going to make you do that behavior more. So what are we adding? We are adding a pleasant consequence that is the result of an action. And so that pleasant consequence is going to make you want to do that action more, right? Or repeat that action. To go back to our same old example of finding $20 in the hallway, finding $20 would be a positive reinforcement or positive reinforcer that makes you want to walk down that hallway again. Another one is getting a bonus, right, at your job. That's going to make you want to keep showing up to your work, right, and actually doing your job. Another could be that your parents gave you a bigger allowance every time you do well on a test. That's going to make you want to do better on tests or continue to do at the same level of work, because getting a bigger allowance is a pleasant consequence for you. Now, he also says that we are also motivated, or we are also reinforced by things being taken away from us. Now, you're probably thinking, how could taking something away from us actually cause us to do something more? That doesn't seem to make sense, right? But in reality, you have to think about, what are we taking away? So sometimes when things are taken away from us that are unpleasant, things that are unwanted, that might cause us pain, or things we want to avoid, right? That we, for lack of better words, we don't like. If those things are taken away from us, we can actually do the behavior that actually takes this away from us more. Now, an interesting example of that is, when we have an alarm clock. I like this example because I need this in my life, right? Now, an alarm clock or your phone makes a really unpleasant sound when you gotta get up in the morning. If it made a really pleasant sound like harps or something like that, you'd probably be like, nah, I'm not. You probably sleep through your alarm. But because if your alarm clock makes a real unpleasant sound, you're more likely gonna get up and turn it off, right? And so if you're anything like me, I even put mine far from my bed, so I'd have to do the added action of literally getting off the bed so I can turn off that annoying alarm clock, right? So, because if it's by my head, I'd probably press snooze, right? So let's think about what's unpleasant. What's the consequence? The unpleasant consequence in that example would be the sound of the alarm clock. In order for me to take that sound away, or avoid that sound, or get rid of that sound, I have to increase my behavior of getting up. I actually have to get up in order to stop that or take that away, right? So what the alarm clock does is that it reinforces my action of getting up by introducing me to an unpleasant consequence. And because that unpleasant consequence is one that I want to avoid, I have to continue to get up every morning and turn it off. Otherwise, the alarm clock is going to keep going until I get up. And so you are being negatively reinforced to get up, or your action of getting up increases because you're trying to take away that unpleasant sound. Another one could be when your mother nags you, right? Nagging is not something you want, but what action might she be nagging you to do more? But for example, she might try to get you to clean your room, right? But the more you clean your room, it's the less nagging you hear. So you take away that nagging sound, right? That unpleasant consequence gets removed from your life, right? Because you actually clean your room. So she's reinforcing you negatively by nagging you. Now you know why she's doing what she's doing, to increase your action of cleaning your room. Now let's take a look at punishment. Now this is one of the other ones, right? So we have reinforcement, means that our behavior happens more, right? And it happens through two processes: positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. But on the other hand, we have punishment. So what is punishment? Punishment is any consequence that follows an action that makes that action less likely to be repeated, or to decrease, or to stop. So anytime an action stops happening, it starts decreasing, it starts weakening. We have to look at the consequence. What's causing that to happen? What's causing that to happen is some type of punishment, right? So some type of punishment is happening here. Now, punishment, usually when people think punishment, they think like corporal punishment or getting spanked or getting beaten. Yes, that's a form of punishment, but there's other ways to punish as well, right? It doesn't have to be physical violence or physical punishment as well. So let's try to keep our mind open when we think about punishment. So in the same way that reinforcement has two kinds, right? Positive and negative. In the same way, positive punishment also has that, right? Let me just make this adjustment here. This is not reinforcement. This should read punishment. Okay. So in the same way that positive punishment has, or reinforcement has two kinds, punishment has two kinds. There's positive punishment and then there's negative punishment. So in the same way that positive before meant adding something, it's the same thing here. And before, whereas negative meant taking something away, it's the same thing. However, now we need to look at what are we adding and what are we taking away. And so let's look at this. So positive punishment is adding an unpleasant consequence as a result of an action that makes that action less likely to happen or to decrease in frequency. So it happens less. The behavior tends to go down or weaken, right? And so an example of that could be spanking, right? If your parents tell you don't jump on the bed and you keep jumping on the bed, how could they stop you from jumping on the bed? They could spank you. Of course, they could do other things, but a real immediate kind of response could be adding something unpleasant. Do you like to be spanked? Now, if you do, that's on you, and I don't really need to know, but I'm just saying. Do most kids like to be spanked? Most kids do not like to be spanked. Spanking is unpleasant, it's painful, right? It makes them cry, it ruins their day. Right? So adding something unpleasant is usually what parents do to stop children from doing something that they don't desire, the parents, right? So if your child is jumping on the bed and you follow that up, that action of jumping up on the bed, you follow that with spanking. The idea of spanking is so you want to stop that action. You want to stop the child from jumping on the bed. So you cause pain, right? For lack of better words, you cause some kind of pain to the child, and the child's going to connect the dots together and then ideally stop, right? This is an ideal case. And then we have negative punishment. So negative means taking away something. So we're talking now about taking away something, but something that you find pleasant. So it's taking away something pleasant that should make the behavior happen less. So in some ways, we have to think about behavior that it's not just adding things that make us do our behavior more or less, it's taking stuff away. And so in this case, your parents tell you, I'll give you an example, your parents give you a curfew and tell you to come home at 10 o'clock at night. I know some of you don't have curfews, but let's go back. At 10 o'clock at night, and you decide to show up whenever you want to, right? Now, your parents, in using negative punishment, could take away something pleasant from you. They could take away your freedom, right? They could tell you you're grounded, right? Your parents could take away your allowance. They could take away your car keys. They could take away your iPad, iPod, iPhone, iWatch, Android stuff. They can take away things that you find desirable. The point of taking away those things is so that you stop doing that behavior. And usually parents do this a lot. They say, you didn't come home on time, so I'm going to take away all of your stuff, right? And so, of course, they could punish you positively for this too, but this is an example of negative punishment. So there are some problems with punishment, and we'll get into this a little more when we see each other. Usually punishment doesn't teach or promote alternative acceptable behaviors, right? It may actually produce undesirable results. It may make people hostile, right? Especially if we use positive punishment a lot rather than negative punishment, where we take stuff away. If we constantly hit and we constantly beat, it can cause hostility in the receiver, the child or whoever is receiving the punishment. It can allow for passivity, make you not feel that you're doing the right thing at all, and it could lead to fear. It could, the change in behavior that punishment leads to is usually temporary, because the person doesn't know what the correct behavior is to do. That's really an interesting thing. If you're not taught what the acceptable behavior is, and you're only punished for the unacceptable behavior, you ultimately learn just to avoid doing the unacceptable behavior when likely to get caught. What you don't learn is what's the acceptable behavior. So, and also, if you see aggression, you tend to do aggression. So you begin to think that being this way, positive punishment especially, is that this is acceptable behavior, and this is what I need to do when I myself am put in a position like this, where I have to punish someone or give someone consequences, that I may actually be aggressive as well, because that's all I know. And so I think we will stop here. Oh no, I have two examples, by the way, of what do we think is reinforcement and punishment. So here's some more examples. So an example of positive reinforcement could be that the dolphin gets fish for doing a trick, so he's rewarded, right? Another way of looking at positive reinforcement is calling it a reward, right, or bonus. A dog gets a piece of liver for returning or coming back to you when you call them. And a child gets dessert for eating a vegetable. That's, some kind of prize, right? So the other one says, when I help around the house, I get praise, I get cookies from my mom. And I'm going to move to negative reinforcement. Some examples are, you wake up to the sound of a loud buzzing alarm clock, right? And when there's a high pollen count, you take your antihistamine to avoid that stuffy nose that you would get, that allergic reaction, right, to the high pollen count. And so the last one says, my room condition report, I guess living in dorms, is due Friday, otherwise you'll be fined, right? So instead of waiting for the fine, which is an unpleasant thing, you sent it in, taking away that threat, right? So you don't have to worry about it because you already did your report. So let's talk about some positive punishment. So positive punishment, remember, is about decreasing behavior by adding something unpleasant, right? Negative punishment is decreasing behavior by taking away something pleasant. So an alcoholic is taking the drug antabuse. Now that's a drug that makes you really, really sick when you drink alcohol. So if they take the drug antabuse, they're gonna get positively punished by something unpleasant, which is being violently ill. And if I drink milk, I get sick. This sounds simple, but if drinking milk gets you sick, every time you drink milk, you get sick. You tend to associate the two and think that, oh my gosh, just the sight of this drink milk should make me sick, and I should not want to drink milk at all. We spank a child after they behave mischievously, right? And then getting bitten by a family dog would make you less likely to try to take his bone from him in the future. Hopefully not. You don't want to take his bone. And then negative punishment is the one night when I was driving at a party, I backed into a mailbox. It cost me $450 to fix my car. Now, the reason why this is negative is that your loss of the $450 is an unpleasant thing to you. So your idea is that you probably won't back up into any kind of mailboxes anymore. You would probably stop that behavior because you don't want to lose another $450, right? If I run a red light, I get a ticket. Getting a ticket is unpleasant, so you stop running red lights, hopefully. And when I was younger, I yelled at my mom, and then I got grounded. Getting grounded is losing your time and your freedom. So hopefully you will stop doing that. And then a child is not allowed to play with their toys after they've behaved mischievously. So the parent takes away the toys from the child. So I hope these kind of clarify some ideas about operant conditioning for you, whether it be positive or negative, right? Getting you to see the differences between reinforcement and punishment, and really give you a really good basis to start thinking about how these concepts fit in everyday life, and how they fit in how we've learned some things throughout our lives. Now, one of the kind of shortcomings is with conditioning is that we really never know what are the exact factors that motivate us to do one thing versus another, because they come at different levels and different times in our lives. So, to go back to parenting, this again makes parenting very difficult. The parent may think that they're punishing a behavior, but then the behavior is getting reinforced by the child's friends or other classmates, or even the stuff that they watch on TV. So it's hard to identify what are motivators or what are reinforcers and what are punishers sometimes in our lives. But with some the examples that we're gonna see, it's a lot easier. So I hope you learn something from this and continue to take a look at what the book says. And I'll see you soon.